Good afternoon. My name is Poole. I'm a species at risk biologist with the province of Manitoba. My co-presenter is Brian Kiss, a mitigation biologist also with the province of Manitoba. Our talk today is entitled Trumpeter Swans in Manitoba, their range expansion and movements at the northern edge of the Mississippi Flyway. For anyone unfamiliar with where Manitoba is, we are the area marked in blue on this map. We're one of the 3 Canadian prairie provinces, and we are part of the administrative organization called the Mississippi Flyway. Manitoba is covered by 4 major ecosystem types. In the south and the southwest, we have prairie, including prairie pothole wetlands. That phases into aspen parkland, which then phases into the boreal forest. In the north, we do have some tundra in the Hudson Bay lowlands. And then north of that, obviously, we have Hudson Bay itself. Our talk then is going to cover the status of trumpeter swans in Manitoba since the 19th century. And then we're going to talk a wee bit about the interior population GPS tagging project in Manitoba. I'm going to finally talk a bit about the current status of trumpeter swans in Manitoba based on various sources of information. But to start with, we think it's important to set the scene and tell the story of trumpeter swans in Manitoba since the 19th century. The assumed breeding range in Manitoba in the 19th century was basically everywhere up to about 300 kilometers south of Hudson Bay. That area would represent anywhere where there would be the 140 to 154 ice-free days each year that would be required for successful breeding. In this period, we only actually have 2 actual documented records of trumpeter swans. The first of these, circled in the map, is at a place called Norway House. That's on an indigenous reserve. And in this case, eggs were taken from a nest in the 1850s, presumably by a collector. We also have an observation closer to Winnipeg in a place called the Shore Lakes in 1893 and 1894. In that case, cygnets were actually observed on the lake. Throughout this period, trumpeter swans are hunted, obviously for their food and also for their quills. Those quills would have been taken along the traditional fur trading routes and would have been traded to Europe through York Factory in the north of the province there. And we do know that the species was extirpated around the turn of the century. Between 1900 and 1979, there were only actually 3 confirmed records of wild trumpeter swans in Manitoba. That's according to the Birds of Manitoba. There was a failed reintroduction, circled here in red on the map. That was at the Delta Marsh Waterfowl Station between 1959 and 1974. In that case, 3 pairs were taken from Montana and from Alberta, and they produced 81 cygnets. Those birds were released in 1972, but they failed to establish a wild population, and the last delta-bred swan was seen in 1981. During this period as well, the trumpeter swan was added to the inaugural endangered species list in Canada in 1978. We started seeing an increase in the number of observations between 1980 and 2008. For certain, more birds were appearing from successful reintroduction programs elsewhere within the Mississippi Flyway, not least Minnesota and Ontario. We also have records of banded birds from Michigan as well during that period. The first confirmed breeding of trumpeter swans in Manitoba for probably around a century was in 2002 in Duck Mountain and in Riding Mountain. In 2007, a breeding bird survey volunteer saw cygnets near Bissett in eastern Manitoba. That was the first record in eastern Manitoba. During this period, trumpeter swans were removed from the endangered species list in Canada in 1996. At this point, in 2009, Manitoba embarked on its first ever breeding bird atlas. We're a large remote province, and as you can see from the map here, the white areas actually represent areas where no atlasing was conducted during this period. The grey areas represent where atlasing was conducted. During this period, trumpeter swans were observed in 91 different atlas squares, and confirmed breeding, i.e. cygnets or an occupied nest or another form of confirmed breeding, was noted in 10 of those 10 by 10 kilometer squares. Most of those records were in an area east of the Red River Valley and in Riding Mountain National Park. In fact, in that area east of the Red River Valley, an area called the Boreal Hardwood Transition, 12% of all surveyed squares had at least one trumpeter swan observation. However, there was negligible occupation in the Tiger Shields and the Hudson Plains, i.e. right in the far north, and in prairie potholes right in the southwest corner. We did have, though, 3 confirmed records in Wapaska National Park. We believe those to be molt migrants. We also, in this period, added trumpeter swan to the Manitoba Endangered Species and Ecosystem Act in 2012. After the atlas, there was a few years, and then Canadian Wildlife Service invited Manitoba, the provincial wildlife branch, to participate in the PhD study conducted by David Wilson. We agreed to deploy 10 GPS tags in Manitoba. Those tags were purchased by the Canadian Wildlife Service, and we thank them for being able to do that. We did manage to deploy all 10, most of them in the east, in that Boreal Hardwood Transition, and one in the west, in the prairie potholes. At first, we tried to target breeding pairs, but due to the difficulties of finding birds and molt and some issues around access and being the first year of COVID-19, we were just, in the end, happy to deploy all 10 on birds of Manitoba. Here is some photos of Brian, who led the tagging effort, tagging, banding, and measuring one of the swans. By October the 20th, 2020, we checked the information on the website that the Trumpeter Swan Society have run, and we found that our first birds had started to migrate south. These birds were actually part of a non-breeding group of six different trumpeter swans that were found on a place called Windy Lake, east of Winnipeg. We tagged 2 of those birds. Anecdotally, it looks like the non-breeding birds were migrating much earlier than the birds which had cygnets. Another issue that we actually found with our birds is we tagged birds in areas with poor cellular reception, and the tags that we were using required a cellular connection to upload the data. In this case, by October the 20th, one of our birds, I think it was probably about 2 months after it was tagged, at least 2 months after it was tagged, has still not even made contact with a cellular network. Fortunately, it did in the end. The main results from Manitoba from the initial analysis that David has done seems to suggest that our birds at the northern periphery of the Mississippi Flyway appear to migrate further south than birds which breed further south. Our birds spend the winter in states such as Missouri and Arkansas. In fact, a bird tagged in Arkansas in winter 2022 was detected in spring 2022 in eastern Manitoba. Another bird that summered Another bird summered in a place called Sturgeon Bay, which had been tagged in Wisconsin. And another bird in 2021 did a huge migration, huge move all the way north through Ontario next door, up to the Hudson Bay coastline, and spent some time around the Kaskatama River Estuary important bird area in northern Manitoba before flying back south again, a presumed molt migrant. All of this information has got us to start thinking more about the status of trumpeter swans in Manitoba and where that population is actually in reality. We started to look at different sources of information. For example, the graph here is our representation of the North American Trumpeter Swan Survey from Riding Mountain National Park, 2005, 10, and 2015. Seen an almost five-fold increase in the numbers of trumpeter swans detected in Riding Mountain in that 10-year period. Another important thing to just look there is the proportion of cygnets. The proportion of cygnets is about the same in every single year, so between 30 and 35% of the total number counted. We can also look at breeding bird survey data, and although we do have a major caveat that the data here for Canada and for Manitoba is low reliability, presumably due to low sample size, in both cases we do see increases. And just talking to the volunteers who conduct those surveys, they are certainly saying the same to us. They're even actually saying now that they're starting to see groups of trumpeter swans flying over in sort of early to mid-June during their surveys, which they've never really seen in the past. In total, that Manitoba 10-year trend up to 2019 was a 27.6% annual increase. Although, given the low reliability and the confidence limits, we can't say for certain how definite that percentage increase is. It certainly is representing, we certainly are seeing a definite increase though. And we've also started to put together our own information. We've taken the atlas, the information from the Breeding Bird Atlas, which is provided by Birds Canada. We were a partner in the Breeding Bird Atlas. We've taken that Breeding Bird Atlas data, and we've taken other sources of data, such as BBS data, such as eBird data, such as volunteer submissions to us and to the Trumpeter Swan Society. We've taken all that data and we have come up with our own map of where we think trumpeter swans are now and what is happening in their range now. And this map here represents the percentage increase in the number of 10 by 10 occupied squares since the end of the Breeding Bird Atlas. So since 2015, we've seen in some places a huge increase of the number of squares occupied by trumpeter swans, whether breeding or just spending the summer molting. In total, that's 140% increase in the number of occupied squares during that period. And most of that change seems to have occurred in places like what I described earlier as the boreal hardwood transition. So that area through the middle, the Aspen Parkland, that's seeing the highest level of increase. We're also seeing them appear to start to breed in prairie potholes in the southwest and in the north. And we've actually represented this in another way as well. This is the atlas information represented in orange here. And this is the added squares, the squares that we've been able to confirm some level of breeding based on the atlas criteria. We also have a couple of squares up at Churchill, right in the far north. But that was probably an accidental, but we included it anyway because they were there during the breeding season. One more observation is that we're seeing more confirmed breeding in Manitoba as a proportion of the overall occupied squares. So during the Breeding Bird Atlas, only 11% of all occupied squares had a measure of confirmed breeding. Now that's 29% of all the squares that we managed to put together. So we're seeing more confirmed breeding as well as the increased range as well. And that's leading us to make a few conclusions. Had seen a rapid increase in the range, particularly seems to be in the last 2 or 3 years since COVID-19. It's actually more than doubling of the overall number of occupied squares in that period. And considering there's parts of Manitoba which were only visited during the Breeding Bird Atlas, there are areas of Manitoba which haven't been actually checked for a long time and could have even more swans than we could be aware than we are aware of. That increased range is likely to continue further north. We can see in the map here, the eBird map, a recent record right in the far north of Manitoba, and another record in Saskatchewan on the Manitoba border here during the Saskatchewan Breeding Bird Atlas. This brings into other questions. At some point, trumpeter swans and tundra swans might start to meet, particularly with climate change and the number of ice-free days potentially declining during some years. Maybe see some interactions on the breeding grounds. But that's for another time. For certain, trumpeter swan is a huge conservation success story, mainly down to the efforts of people across the flyway. People outside of Manitoba who put huge effort into recovering this species. Although it's still listed as endangered under our own Endangered Species and Ecosystems Act, current trends and the range expansion that we are observing suggests that this species is reaching a level of recovery where downlisting could be considered in the near future. And that's a success, and it's something to celebrate. So thank you for all those who have helped us to put this talk together, particularly the Canadian Wildlife Service again for the purchasing of the GPS tags. And thank you for your time today. Thank you.